This episode of Frankly Speaking features Manish Tewari, the new Information and Broadcasting Minister who's led the government charge on various issues, including the 2G controversy. He's been the voice of the Congress on television, and on this episode, Manish Tewari takes straight questions on the recent controversies that have made headlines, including the row over the CAG.
Mr. Manish Tewari, thank you very much. It's great to see you.
It's
Manish,
always great to see you, my friend.
thank you for giving me time.
The pleasure is all mine.
You're going to be frank on this chat.
Well, as frank as I possibly can.
And what are your limits?
Well, obviously, if you're talking to me as a person, then there are no limits. But if you're talking to me as one of the spokespersons of the government, then I'm bound by the confines of government positions.
Let's see how those confines are. Manish Tewari, I have a few straight questions for you.
Go right
Let's
ahead.
start with Parliament. Who was responsible for the 4 days of delay? It was the government, wasn't it? The 4 days that were wasted in this session of Parliament were entirely a result of the government trying to muster up the numbers and give the excuse of not being open to a vote.
Well, I think, Arnab, it's important to understand that over the past 8 years, whenever the push has come to the shove, we've never been found wanting. However, insofar as FDI and multi-brand retail is concerned, it raises a very fundamental question. And the fundamental question is, as an executive, do we or don't we have the right to take decisions which
Yes.
we think are in national interest?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, if every policy decision which a government takes is going to be subjected to a parliament vote, then what are the kind of traditions and what are the kind of canons that we are laying
But
down?
that was a 4-day argument for the government.
Well, I think the government has been making this argument since September.
But now you're open for a vote.
Well, essentially, that's something which the Speaker has to decide. If tomorrow the Speaker in her wisdom decides that the 184 notice has to be accepted, then there would be a vote, as it happened on black money or it happened on inflation. But if the Speaker in her wisdom decides to reject the notice, then obviously the discussion would be under a
Mr.
different
Tewari,
rule.
I'm not talking about the Speaker. I'm asking, how did your government go from an initial position of Parliament ultimately must run according to the rule book, which is the position on 22nd, which is against the vote position, to a position on the 26th and 27th, Kamal Nath saying we are not concerned about a vote. That's a U-turn.
Well, I don't think that's a U-turn at all, because at the end of the day, Parliament does run by the rule book, and who decides as to who the what the rules are? It is the Speaker or the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha who does. So eventually, a member gives a notice or a party gives a notice. The notice is considered by the presiding officer, and they take a call whether to accept it or reject it. Government was on a more fundamental point, and that fundamental point being that does every executive decision of the government have to be subjected to a vote in Parliament?
But you changed your position on that. Let me quote you. If you say the earlier position was it would set a very unhealthy precedent to an executive decision being subservient in this manner, so you made it a matter of principle. You made this an issue of principle. You agree with me on that, Manish?
Well,
On the issue of voting?
Well, I think we were laying down a very legitimate concern for people to consider.
How did the concern dissipate in 4 days once the DMK said yes?
Well, I don't think that the concern has dissipated. The concern remains the same. Eventually, insofar as a notice is concerned, it has to be adjudicated upon by the Speaker. If the Speaker in her wisdom takes the decision that 184 has to be accepted, there would be a vote, as it happened in the case of black money or it happened in the case of inflation. But if the Speaker in her wisdom tomorrow decides that no, this is not something which falls within the rules.
You are shooting off the Speaker's shoulder, Mr. Tewari.
Well, I don't think I'm shooting off the Speaker's shoulder. You cannot take away the Speaker's prerogative in this context.
The 4 days were wasted not because of the Speaker's prerogative, which a decision is still pending. The 4 days were wasted because you were jittery on whether your allies like the DMK will support you 4 days out of a 20-day session, Mr. Tewari, because you didn't get your floor strategy right.
The 4 days were wasted because the opposition decided to continue with the disruptive strategy which they had put in place in November 2010 on the basis of mythical numbers, which was again perpetuated in the last monsoon session of Parliament. That is why we've lost those 4 days. Eventually, Arnab, eventually, let's come down to the brass tacks. And what are the brass tacks? We are only putting in place an enabling framework. We are not forcing a policy decision down somebody's throat. If tomorrow the government of West Bengal does not want FDI and multi-brand retail...
That argument does not hold.
Well, I think that is the germane argument.
Because Pranab Mukherjee made a completely different promise, and I can quote you exactly what he said.
Well, what did Mr. Mukherjee say? He said that everybody would be consulted.
He said political parties, a consensus will have to be formed. Until that consensus is formed, a decision will not be taken. Well, in the absence of a consensus, you are saying what he said in November last year, our Honourable President, who was then Finance Minister, is irrelevant? Or have you shifted your goalpost, Mr.
I think you need to draw a distinction between consensus and unanimity. There is a distinction between consensus and unanimity.
You didn't make that distinction.
So therefore, the then finance minister, who was the leader of the House, did not use the word unanimity. He said, we'll strive for a consensus. But if there is no consensus, forget unanimity. Obviously, a government is free and flexible to take its own decision.
Mr. Tewari, the Congress party has a lot of astute lawyers like yourself who keep shifting the goalposts and emphasize on there the smile comes up. Who keep shifting the goalposts and emphasize on certain words when it suits them. You can equally be accused of turning your own logic back on yourself, and I'd like to take you back to 2001, and you know what I'm talking about. Mr. Anand Sharma says now that in the history of Indian parliamentary democracy, an executive decision has never been dragged into parliament. You're seconding him. However, it was you who set the precedent. In the case of the debate on the disinvestment of Balco in 2001, was that not a policy decision? Why did you demand a vote? Were you not on the other side? Were you not where the BJP is today? And is the BJP not where the Congress was in 2011?
Allow me a minute to answer you holistically. If you go back to 1956, when the Abadi resolution... I'm coming to 2001, it goes back to 1956, and that's why I'm explaining it. If you go back to 1956, when the Abadi resolution on the socialistic pattern of society was adopted, the socialist model held the commanding height till 1991. In 1991, you liberalized the Indian economy, and by 2001, you came to the stage where you started disinvesting in public sector units. There was a legitimate argument being made at that point in time that these are institutions which have been created out of people's money, so therefore you are really selling the family silver. And that is why, if you would recall, that in the case of HPCL and BPCL, when government tried to disinvest, the then NDA government, it ended up in Supreme Court and getting struck down. Here, what you are doing is just putting an enabling framework in place whereby you are giving the states the flexibility, the latitude and the option.
If they decide, who decides? I have two follow-up questions to you. Is this that was a policy decision? This is a policy decision, right or wrong? B, who decides what is a legitimate or an illegitimate argument? The opposition can certainly say that this will have a cascading effect on the Indian economy, on certain sections of our economy, on the mom and pop shops, on individuals, and hence on the country as a whole. And besides which, when on the 27th of November, the finance minister last year has made a promise on the floor of the House, you have to stand by it. Well, therefore, the legitimacy of the argument is a completely subjective thing.
I think I've explained the promise made by the then finance minister very succinctly, and insofar as the distinction between Balco and FDI and multi-brand retail is concerned, it's like comparing apples and pears.
They're both administrative decisions.
That was a decision to disinvest. This is a decision to create an enabling framework.
They're both administrative decisions.
So therefore, there are various policy decisions which are taken by government at various points in time. And how does court test them out? The court tests us out on the basis of the Wednesbury principle, whether there is a nexus to reasonableness. And here, the opposition is being unreasonable by asking the government to undergo a vote test on a decision. It's not a question of being scared. It's a question of a principle.
The principle is that you are trying to draw a distinction between FDI. I'll move on from this, between FDI and Balco, but however much you try and dress it up, both are administrative decisions.
Well, I think, Arnab, you need to make a distinction between an administrative decision and a policy decision. This is an administrative decision which creates an enabling framework. That was a policy decision to disinvest. So I think that's a subtle distinction which needs to be kept in mind.
Communalism, this whole communalism, an easy escape route for you and your friends. You know, UPA government milked it to the hilt. And the DMK said that we do not agree, we are very bitterly supporting you on FDI. But that's because we want to keep communal parties like the BJP out. Don't you think everybody's seen through it? It was a very convenient use of the communalism card by the DMK, wasn't it?
The fundamental fault line in Indian politics is communalism, qua secularism or pluralism. And that fault line does not change. At the end of the day, if a right-wing party which has credentials which are definitely less than secular, wants to milk every issue for political gain.
Which the DMK was in government with. Which the DMK was in government with.
Well, in the sense
that's a fault line not exist then?
Well, that's a question which you should address to the DMK. Over a period of time, they could have revised their position. A lot of parties, post-2002 Gujarat, did revise their positions, including the National Conference.
They were in government post-2002 as well.
Well,
they were in government with the NDA post-2002.
And let's not forget, they pulled out of government, before the NDA went into the 2004 poll.
No, but for 2 years they were in government after the Gujarat election.
So therefore, the DMK did not contest the 2004 elections along with the BJP. They contested the 2004 elections in conjunction with the Congress party.
Mr. Tewari, how was this fault line not existing 7 days back and the DMK discovered this fault line now?
Well, I think the fault line was always there. I think the fault line was always there. At the end of the day, Arnab, it's not about what is behind the scenes. It is about what is in front of the scene. And what is there in front of the scene is that there is a fundamental fault line in Indian politics, and at the end of the day, people have to weigh in whether they stand to the left of that fault line or they stand to the right of that fault line. And all those who believe in pluralism, who believe in secularism, know exactly at what point in time to weigh in on the right side.
Are you saying the left is not secular?
Well, all I'm saying is that the left also needs to reconsider some of its positions, because, they have a certain worldview which stems out of a certain ideological disposition which is premised on anti-Americanism. They have a certain economic thought process, and they're entitled to that thought process. But I think at some point in time, they need to find a convergence between their economic philosophy and the pluralism intrinsic in their politics.
As a final recourse, did you milk the communalism card or not? Yes or no, Manish Tewari? Then we move on from that.
Well, I think...
Because a lot of people think that not you personally, but Kamal Nath did. It was smart politics,
Arnab,
but not sincere.
Well, Arnab, at the end of the day, there are no cards to milk and there are no cows to milk. As I earlier pointed out, this is the fundamental fault line which everybody recognizes, and they realize that there is a certain taint which is attached to getting associated with the politics of right reaction.
I think the bigger fault line is between you and the CAG. I think that's the bigger fault.
Are you talking about me, or are you talking about the UPA government?
I'm both talking about you and the UPA government. Are you suggesting?
My understanding
that the CAG Vinod Rai is close to BJP leaders and is therefore being influenced in his report? If you are suggesting, you must say it. If you are not suggesting, you must say that as well.